Hello everyone, welcome once again to this web conference sponsored by the Missouri Department of Mental Health on Rethinking Guardianship. My name is Tom Pansella. I'm with the Missouri Institute of Mental Health, and I thank you for taking the time to join us today. We are joined by Nancy Nicholas, and I'll introduce her to you in just a moment. But for those folks who are interested in continuing education credit, as I said, this is a program in the Department of Mental Health web conference series, and so there are 2 links for CEUs underneath the video window. If you work for the Department of Mental Health or one of their provider agencies, please use that link. Everybody else, please use the other one. There is a link to Nancy's slides also underneath the video window, and so if you'd like to see those in a separate pop-up window, you may click on that link. At any time, if you have questions for Nancy today, please use the email questions for speaker link. That will submit those questions to us, and we will ask them on your behalf. We've already started getting a couple questions in, and so you can submit those at any time. And so now I'd like to introduce Nancy Nicholas. And she obtained her master's in social work from the University of Missouri. She began working with individuals with disabilities as a direct support worker in the early 1980s. Nancy worked as a service coordinator with individuals with mental illness for 11 years. In 1994, she began her work at the Department of Mental Health, Division of Developmental Disabilities. She has experience in working in the division's federal programs unit with home and community-based waivers, self-directed services, targeted case management programs, and many, many other division initiatives. She's currently a member of the division's Transformation Initiative promoting the goal of community living for individuals with disabilities with long-term care needs. On a personal note, I've had the privilege of working with Nancy for the last couple of years on a couple of projects, and I have rarely met someone more passionate about the work that she does. And so Nancy, it's great that you're here with us today.
Well, thank you so much, Tom, for that very kind introduction, and welcome everyone who's chose to tune in to this workshop today. Today I'm going to be talking about guardianship, and I want to make clear what I am going to be talking about versus what I'm not going to be talking about. What I'm not going to be talking about is the legal process by which you obtain a guardianship. But what I am going to be talking about today are those things that we need to consider when we're thinking about pursuing guardianships for someone, and also what alternatives may be available to us if we think that someone needs some additional support needs in their life. Guardianship is a legal process, and it's designed, and the intent of it is to protect vulnerable people from abuse, from neglect, from poor choices. Guardians assist people in meeting different needs for services and supports and different financial and health care needs. Guardians should always assist people with making choices that are in their best interest. So what is the issue here? Why do we want to talk about alternatives to guardianships? How else can we keep people healthy and safe? Well, I think it's important to consider other options because all of us have certain things in our life that have been milestones as far as our growing and being who we are today. Those types of things are rights that we have, such as voting, getting married, living with who we want, working with who we want. And when we impose guardianships on individuals, we are taking away the opportunity for them to grow through those experiences. One of the things that is the foundation of the Division of Developmental Disabilities value system is that of self-determination. Self-determination is defined through a variety of different principles, and some of those principles are the freedom to make choices about where one lives, who one lives with, the authority to take control of their own services system and control over making decisions for oneself, to decide what kind of supports you need, when you need them, how you want them delivered, and by whom. The responsibility when you're making those choices to be good stewards of public dollars, but also being able, through support from other people, to understand what risks there are in making some of the choices that we make, and trying to figure out ways to minimize those risks. And finally, through confirmation, to be a part of the services system, part of the solution to making services and supports in the world a better place for all people, including people with disabilities. With guardianship, taking that control taking those the ability to make those choices away from someone, there's a natural friction between guardianship and self-determination. Now, of course, people need to be healthy and people need to be safe. So the question is, what steps can be taken to make sure that guardianship is in the best interest of the individual, or what alternatives can we consider that continue to keep the person healthy and safe and at minimum risk without taking away that choice and control? Guardianship is a legal solution to a problem or set of problems. And so I think the question that we need to ask ourselves is, are there ways that we can solve those problems that can be handled in a less intrusive means? So for the remainder of today, really what we're going to talk about is what the alternatives to guardianship are, and alternatives which are respectful of the person's rights and privileges. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about the person-centered planning process. And I want to define person-centered planning a little bit for you. We have a lot of people talk about person-centered planning nowadays. It's kind of a buzzword. But really, what's the difference between systems planning and person-centered planning? Well, I think one of the differences is that the person really is at the core of the person-centered plan. The person decides who is going to be at their planning meeting, and it's not just a bunch of professionals sitting around the table with the individual, talking about the individual's deficits. The best plans that I have seen are plans where the person decides who will be there, and they've included clergy and family members and friends and neighbors, because those are the people who can really think outside the box. Those are the people that can really help problem solve. Those are the people who will gladly take on responsibility to make sure things are done. Because a person-centered plan is not a one-time planning meeting, and it's not about the piece of paper. It's about taking action on behalf of the individual and making sure that ultimately the person's life is what the person wants it to be. One of the questions that you can ask in person-centered planning is, what's the real problem? Sometimes I think that we think we know what the problem is, but we really don't. Person-centered planning, when it's worked right, thinks about where the person wants to go and what risks or barriers are in place to keep the person from getting there. And then the planning team comes together to talk about what would be the consequence of the person taking that risk. What strategies can we put in place to address and reduce or eliminate the risk? And does it consider potential opportunities that are lost if we impose certain restrictions on the individual's life? Some people talk about person-centered planning in terms of what is best for the person and what's important to the person. So what's important to the person and what's important for the person. There's a myth out there that person-centered planning doesn't deal with real hard issues, and in fact it's quite the opposite. It's the coming together of people to look at difficult situations and figuring out a way to solve those problems that really makes person-centered planning an effective tool in this particular case. I want to tell you a little story about Paul. Paul was an individual that lived in an ISL, and he'd lived there for quite some time. Now, Paul was a person who never had any significant behavioral issues, and suddenly, seemingly out of the blue, his staff noticed that he was becoming more and more agitated. Over time, Paul began to knock holes in walls, and Paul began to strike out at other people in his ISL, including staff. And so suddenly the problem became Paul's behavior and Paul's acting out. Now, Paul was looked at physically to make sure there wasn't anything physically wrong, but they didn't find anything physically wrong. And eventually, Paul's behavior resulted in some hospitalizations. Now, what happened was his old service coordinator was contacted by his new service coordinator, and they said, hey, there's some things going on with Paul. We can't figure out what's happening. Can you help us? And what was discovered in the planning meeting was that a new provider had taken over Paul's ISL. The staff had turned over, and Paul was a guy who was really, like many of us, married to his rituals. He liked his day to go in a certain way. And when the ISL was sold and when new staff took over, his rituals were turned topsy-turvy. Paul couldn't communicate with words. He didn't understand why new people had come into his home. He didn't understand why he no longer was able to take a shower when he got home from the workshop, but was asked to take one in the morning. He didn't understand why those routines that were so comforting to him were suddenly taken away from him. Now, when they first came together as a planning team, one of the things on the table was guardianship. But what the team decided to do was to reintroduce Paul's old routine into his life and see what happened. And when they did that, Paul's behavior became manageable once again. In other words, staff listened to what was important to Paul, and guardianship was no longer included as an option. Let's talk a little bit about what does the person really, really need. Sometimes I think that people want to pursue guardianship because they want to make sure that the person's totally healthy and safe, and they really haven't done a good assessment of what the person really, truly needs. What small portion of their life they really do need help with. So what if it's money management? Well, there are some alternatives with money management. I'm going to talk a little bit about Debbie. Debbie was someone that I had in my caseload many years ago, and Debbie was an individual who had a cognitive disability. She also had a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. And when Debbie became symptomatic and things weren't going well for her, she would start spending money. She would go on the home shopping networks. She would write checks that bounced, which got her in trouble with the law. If anyone tried to approach her about those issues, she would get very anxious and upset. Debbie had a sister who was very involved in her life, and her sister pulled together the support staff of the home and myself and said, I think in order to get rid of all of these problems, I really need to become Debbie's guardian. Well, one of the support staff said, you know, isn't it true if you get Debbie a guardian, she won't be able to vote? And that is so important to her. She is so involved in the electoral process. She loves to go down and volunteer when there's someone running for a local election that she really thinks highly of. I don't think that Debbie would have the quality of life she deserves if we took that away from her. So once again, the team dug deep and they started talking about how they can put a plan of support around Debbie to minimize the risk and meet the sister's need to keep her safe, but still allow Debbie the independence to make choices and to have control over her life. And so they did several things. One thing they did was they entered into a bill payer program, a program that allowed the bills that she had, including her rent and her utilities, to be direct billed and pulled out of her account automatically. Another thing they did was they had the account set up as a dual signature account, so that not only the sister needed to sign the check, but Debbie as well. And that way Debbie couldn't go out and write checks until her sister was assured that there were sufficient funds in the account. But the other thing they did, and I thought this was very clever, and it was suggested by one of the direct support staff members, was they went out and they bought, at the beginning of each month, some Visa debit cards. And once a week, they gave Debbie, on Sundays when her sister came to take her to church, a Visa debit card. And you can't overspend on a debit card. And so Debbie knew when that debit card was gone, that was how much money she could spend that week. The other thing that the planning team did, and I think, again, this was really critical for Debbie, was they got together and they talked about the things, the signs of her decomposition. So, one staff member noticed that she didn't read her Bible as much when she was becoming ill. And another staff member noticed that she didn't sleep as well when she was decompensating. And so they threw the ball back in Debbie's court and they said, Debbie, when these things start happening to you, what is it that we can do to help you realize that you're starting to decompensate? And so a plan was put in place with strategies surrounding her decompensation and also the other strategies that I just described to you. Did it totally eliminate risk? Absolutely not. All of us have risk in our lives. There's no way to get rid of risk. But what it did do was it reduced the risk to the point where the staff and her sister were comfortable with letting things go in that direction. And Debbie was not placed under guardianship. Another thing that people may want to use is the Social Security representative payment programs. Anyone who receives Social Security, of course, can have a payee, and that payee can assist the individual with expending those funds in the person's best interest. If a substantial amount of money comes into someone's life, perhaps through the death of a parent, or parents may want to set this up before they pass away, they can ensure security for their child by developing and setting up a trust. Again, these are things that may require and do require assistance from an attorney. I do know of a guy, his name was Sam, and Sam was someone who had multiple disabilities, but one of those disabilities was alcohol and drug abuse. His father was very concerned that if he passed away and left Sam a substantial amount of money, that A, his disability would be at risk of losing it, and B, that Sam would frankly expend the money on things he shouldn't, like drugs and alcohol. And so the father set up a trust that was very specific. It paid Sam's bills. It allowed for an allowance for Sam, a specific amount per month. And while they couldn't control everything in Sam's life because Sam needed to be in control himself, it was there to help Sam be safe and live the life that he wanted to live. What about conservatorship? Well, in Missouri there are conservatorships, and a conservatorship, of course, is when a person is appointed by the court to make financial decisions on behalf of a particular individual. Conservatorships, like guardianships, can be limited. And under conservatorship, the important point, I think, is that the person maintains the right to control other parts of their lives, like the ability to choose where they live, to vote, to drive, to get married, and things of that sort. Again, I think it's very important when considering all of these options that we plan with the person, not for the person, but with the person. And we need to ask ourselves on a regular basis, is the strategy we're talking about the least restrictive strategy? Have we clearly defined what the person's need is? And have we really thought about strategies to meet that need? Another issue that sometimes people receive guardianships for are health care concerns. People who need decisions because they have some medical conditions. A power of attorney, specifically a healthcare power of attorney, is when the court assigns an individual to act as an agent for a person with a disability or for another individual. The agent may, its purview may be specific or generalized to something like specific like healthcare. A healthcare power of attorney gives the designated person the authority to make healthcare decisions. And again, the decision maintains the rights and privileges of typical community members. And here's an example of that. There's an individual named John, and John does live in a group home. John is a person who has always been able to take care of small amounts of money. He has a cognitive disability. He understands how to shop for himself and to do those other daily activities of daily living that are important throughout daily life. But John is getting up in age, and he has been having some health care issues. And so when he went into the hospital to potentially have surgery, the hospital asked that John be assigned a guardian, or recommended that John obtain a guardian, because the surgeon didn't feel like he could give consent for treatment. Now, rather than go toward the route of guardianship, a friend of John, who has been his friend for 25 years, Richard, agreed to be to take power of attorney for John and to assist him in making those health care decisions. Because again, in the other areas of his life, John was quite comfortable in making decisions for himself with the assistance of staff. Talk a little bit about full guardianship versus limited guardianship. Well, of course, Missouri statutes do recognize that there is an option for limited guardianship for people. The problem is that through my experience, and I think through the experiences some others in the field, is that for whatever reason, the court systems in Missouri seem hesitant to award limited guardianships in some states. When I was doing some research, I saw that in the state of New Hampshire, 90% of the guardianships in New Hampshire are actually limited and not full guardianships. And what a limited guardianship allows is for an individual to make decisions on behalf of someone in just a limited area of their life, leaving them free to make choices in other areas of their life. And this tells me a couple of things. The first thing I think is that we really need to educate family members and who have children that are transitioning, for instance. We need to educate people with disabilities and staff. But most importantly, we really need to educate our legal system and our judges and our court systems about why limited guardianships and these other alternatives are so important and can be so successful. So besides some of the other things that we've talked about today, what are other reasons to try to find a different alternative than full guardianship or guardianship? Well, first of all, it's the expense. Many of the people that we support, or people that are seeking guardianships, don't have the financial resources to be adequately represented during guardianship hearings. It costs for the attorneys and for evaluations. Those things can be expensive. The other thing is what we just talked about, and that is that all or none attitude that seems to be in existence in some areas of the state. That although the courts do have the option of assigning or appointing a partial guardian to make specific decisions on behalf of an individual, courts often do not follow the law in promoting partial guardianships. It's easier to inflict full guardianship on someone, even if it's unnecessary. The other thing is that once someone receives a guardian, it's very difficult to modify or terminate the guardianship. And what I mean by difficult is it takes resources. And so if a parent decides that when their child transitions at the age of 18, they're going to obtain guardianship for that child, what they may be doing is removing that child's rights from him for the remainder of their life. And those things that really make us human beings, and those life experiences that make us who we are, like getting married and like voting and like driving a car and all of those things, those may be things that child then does not have the opportunity to experience. And I think that as direct support individuals, or as professionals, or as family members that have this knowledge, I think it's really incumbent upon us to share information with people about what alternatives do exist for people, so that the least restrictive path is taken, and that people are supported in leading self-determined lives. So what I would encourage people to ask themselves is, when someone is saying, maybe we should get a guardianship for this person, is the person-centered plan that's in place really person-centered? Have we gathered the right people together at the table to talk about this person, or to talk to this person? Has the person themselves led the discussion about what's important in their lives? Does the plan accurately reflect the person? Does it reflect their preferences and their desires? Does it really assess the risks that the person may be undergoing? Does it really describe what support needs are in place to minimize, not eliminate, but minimize that risk? And does more planning need to be done? Because a real person-centered plan doesn't just sit there. It's always moving and growing and changing with the needs of the individual. Another question is what do we need to do? If things have changed, what do we need to do to adequately address the person's need? And if whatever is happening, is that something that is inconvenient for staff? Is it just irritating to staff? Or is it something that really, really does need to change? The last question, I think, is, do the benefits of guardianship outweigh the impact on the person's life? The loss of rights, the loss of control, and the ability to lead a self-determined life. So those are some of the considerations that I think that are important. Just a few resources that I would encourage people to seek out. First of all, the Missouri Planning Council for Developmental Disabilities is having a series of trainings throughout the state, and anyone that's interested in learning about alternative guardianship or redeterminations of guardianship, I would encourage you to attend. Information about these can be found on the Missouri Planning Council website at mpcdd.com. And those sessions will be held in Rolla on September 10th, Farmington on September 23rd, Bowling Green on September 24th, and Joplin on October 20th. And in addition, I would encourage individuals to look at the Missouri Protection and Advocacy website. There is a manual about guardianship and conservatorship on their website that really does go into more detail about the legal aspects of guardianship and conservatorship. Thank you all for coming. Oh, Tom?
We do encourage you that if you do have questions, you can go ahead and use that question for speaker link underneath the video window. And Nancy, this one came in, you addressed this a little bit, this one came in kind of just before we got started. And she talked about having recent court experiences where judges have been unwilling to consider the partial guardianship, even though DMH recommended it. You talked about there needs to be efforts. Are you aware of any efforts to train judges in consideration of partial guardianship where it's appropriate?
You know, I'm not aware of anything right at this moment, but I have had some conversations with my friends over at the Missouri Planning Council, and it's one of the things that I really think needs to happen, and I would encourage them to move forward with an initiative to do that.
And as I see it at the moment, there aren't any further questions, and so if any more come in, I will try and forward them to you or something.
That sounds great.
But in the meantime, Nancy, thank you for your time today. Thank you for your time. Please stay tuned to the website if you have any, if you'd like to be aware of any other further web conferences that we have coming up, or any of the other formats that we use, the live conferences, the DVD releases that we do. All of that's kept up to date on our website. We also keep people notified via email more often than not. much more frequently than we do anything in the U.S. mail these days. And so if you'd like to join our email list, please do so through the website. That's linked right there on the website on the right side. You can join our email at any time. Pass that along to your friends as well. For those who are still looking for continuing education credit, those 2 links are still available. It's a Department of Mental Health sponsored program. And so if you work for the Department of Mental Health in Missouri or one of the providers here, then please use that link. Everybody else, please use the other one. And other than that, we thank you for your time, Nancy.
You're very welcome.
And thank you for your time.